Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
That we can now join Piers Corbyn. Piers is in London. You know all about Piers. I told you all about him earlier on. Piers is weatheraction.com. By the way, subscribe to weatheraction.com. Go to the website. It's operated and owned by Piers. He's been making weather forecasts accurately for many, many years. And of course, as we know, he's been challenging the notion that man-made CO2 is driving climate on planet Earth. And he's been on the programme several times before talking about that. Real pleasure to welcome back to the show Piers Corbyn. Piers, thanks for taking the call. How are you?
Oh, well, I'm fine.
You're busy and...
Yeah, I am. I'm busy, and I'm glad you advertised our website because we've got some special very much reduced rates which are going to end today.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to tweet it out. I'm going to tweet it out again.
Weatheraction.com.
Weatheraction.com. Piers needs support as well, so do support him and subscribe to him there if you can. I really appreciate that. Piers, what's going on with Hurricane Irma? As you understand it, how do weather events like this, how do they occur? How do they begin? What are they? And what's responsible?
I think the thing to understand about hurricanes and also about earthquakes is they're things which are trying to happen, if you like. You know, in the summer you've got these warm seas in the Caribbean or the Atlantic, and given the right circumstances, these big events, big storms will develop. And if there's something to trigger them, they will develop more effectively and even start when they otherwise wouldn't. And the thing that triggers them is solar activity. And I think it's fair to say that all the biggest tropical storms started when there was some solar flare or special coronal activity on the sun. And in particular, these last three that formed, Irma, Jose and Katia were all formed when there was extra solar activity, and then once they had formed, there was a huge X 9.3 flare on the sun, for example, and that is the biggest one that happened for 11 years. And on the same time as that happened, within hours, Irma reached its lowest pressure of 914 millibars and its highest speed of 160 miles an hour. And then a couple of days later, there was that gigantic earthquake in Mexico. So, you know, to our understanding, these things are all connected, and basically solar activity triggers these extreme events. The earthquakes is more complicated, but it does seem that the biggest earthquakes are indeed triggered by solar activity. And if you remember that great big Japan earthquake and the tsunami, that happened when there was a large Earth-facing coronal hole on the sun. That means the solar corona had a big hole in, and there was very fast electrons coming out of that hole and various particles heading to Earth.
Now, Piers, you believe this is irrefutable, that
Yes, it's irrefutable, yeah.
These events coincided with these big solar flares you talked about. Why are we not hearing on BBC Radio 4 in the mornings or Radio 5, why are we not hearing from meteorologists about these solar flares and their relationship with the hurricanes? Why not?
Well, that's if they wanted to serve the public, that's what they'd do. They'd be reporting daily on solar activity, and, you know, when there was a big flare, they'd say, my God, this is going to do something. Or they'd have our forecasts of solar flares and events, and we issue these all the time and estimate on associated events. Why don't they want that? Well, it cuts the narrative of their story, which is that carbon dioxide does these things. Now, look, it's completely mentally deranged to argue that carbon dioxide is somehow triggering these earthquakes, because earthquakes maybe, but these tropical storms. Because what's so special about carbon dioxide last week, which would have caused these storms? There was nothing special happening with carbon dioxide. There was no extra carbon dioxide. So why did we suddenly have three big storms racking across the Atlantic, and one of them turned out to be the biggest since Hurricane Andrew to hit Florida? I mean, you know, there's just no case to say this is caused by CO2 when at the same time, we've got these predicted solar flares happening, or some of them were predicted, and corresponding tropical storm developments.
Is it possible, Piers, and by the way, folks, Piers' website is weatheraction.com. I'm going to mention this several times because there isn't another man on planet Earth asking the questions or doing the research that Piers is doing on weather systems and on climate change. Piers, is it possible? You just hinted at it there. Is it possible to predict a solar flare itself? So can you look at data and think, right, we're due a big solar flare?
Oh yeah, we can. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we do that. It's slightly more general what we predict, and we got at the middle of this month, and we've got a tropical storms forecast which spells this out. The middle of this month, there's going to be a big increase of solar activity, which will include solar flares and quite likely an Earth-facing coronal hole, and at the minimum a lot of sunspots, and they will come, and they will trigger the formation of some tropical storms.
Where, Piers?
Well, there'll be some in the Atlantic, which we have spelt out the likely regions based on previous incidences. I can't remember the precise ones, but areas, but I'm just looking around here for it. And there's also going to be some happening in the Pacific. So some typhoons are going to form, and some tropical storms are going to form.
They could be catastrophic, right?
Well, there'll be serious ones, yes. We're in for a kind of series of quite serious tropical storms and typhoons, which are going to carry on this month, next month, and likely some in November, although it's late to have them. That's not impossible.
Now, Piers,
you can have them in December, even typhoons at times.
In December. Now, again, I'm just going to mention again, to keep up to date with these projections and forecasts by Piers, go to weatheraction.com, subscribe there. Piers, I've been following this for years. I don't understand it like you do, but I understand you to be a bit of a weather historian. Nobody knows the history of the weather, in my opinion anyway. Nobody understands it as you do. These horrendous storms, Piers, that we've seen in the last couple of weeks, these massive catastrophic events, is there historical evidence that similar storms happened 100 years ago, 200 years ago?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. They're not actually this serious. As I said, the last time a Category 5 storm hit Florida was Hurricane Andrew in 1992. And as I said, that was formed on and powered up by a solar flare on August the 17th. There was a solar flare that day. Hurricane Andrew formed and developed in the way described. And last time there was a solar flare as big as the one we just had was on the 5th of December 2006. And that period coincided with a super typhoon, Durian, which in fact on that day was hitting Saigon, and it had already powered down, but it powered up again to a Typhoon 1, but it had reached Typhoon 5, I think, earlier on, where it had been triggered by some previous activity.
Tell me about
there's loads of this stuff. You go on back and back, you can find the biggest storms in history, of course, we don't know what was happening on the sun, but I would say that it's extremely likely there was events on the sun.
And the big 2004 tsunami that made the news, and it was huge. They made a film about it, of course. Did that coincide with solar activity as well, Piers?
It did. As I said, the big Japan earthquake happened when there was a large Earth-facing coronal hole. And we noted that, and that was one thing which led us to do a lot more research. What we basically find is that the biggest tropical storms and the biggest earthquakes, though the statistics are more difficult, but it only applies to the biggest earthquakes, are triggered by major events on the sun, a certain proportion of which are predictable.
And Piers, there are records going back centuries 16th, 17th century of major storms, major weather events. I just want to make that point. Just before you know who you're talking to, and listeners are talking to us about, attempts to manipulate weather systems and agreements made historically. And we might come to that in a second. But before that, I obviously did geography in school like everybody else. And I remember learning about earthquakes, and we had to, if we didn't know, we used to get a rap on the knuckles with a ruler. This is true, by the way. We had to be able to point out, this is true. We used to have to be able to point out on a relief map of the world. We used to have to be able to point out the fault lines and the tectonic plates. So I understood that tectonic plate movement, subterranean movement causes earthquakes. Explain to our listeners how solar activity can influence the movement of the plates.
Well, think of it like this, that the plates are always trying to move. They're pushing against each other. And it's a question of when are they going to slip. And if you think of an analogy, get a packet of sugar and start spilling it, right? Now, if you just tilt the packet of sugar, then nothing will happen, and then a great lump will come out, go poof, like that. However, if you tap the packet of sugar while it's tipping, go tap, 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 then the sugar will come out in a stream or in little bursts. You won't get a big dollop. So if you like, tectonic plates are like the packet of sugar. There's something is got to happen at some point because they're pushing. When there's low solar activity, what happens is nothing, and then some trigger event happens on the sun, and you get a big earthquake. If there is a lot of solar activity, funnily enough, what will happen is you get a lot of knocking of the plates, and you get a lot of small earthquakes. And this is why the biggest earthquakes in history have always occurred in periods of low solar activity. So you've got the low solar activity and then occasional big activity, like this X3 flare, this X9.3 flare, which will trigger something which has been waiting to happen and hasn't had a chance to happen because it wasn't given enough push.
The vast majority of people in this country won't know any of this because, again, not to constantly decry the national press, but we just don't ever hear any of this on television or radio. We don't read about it.
No, of course not. But if you think about it, you see, these tectonic plates are trying to move, and something can trigger them. Something will trigger them if it can. It's like if you stand a pencil up on the table, it's going to fall over if you have a little draft at some point. You see, now this is what this is about, and there is a connection. But we can understand Earth has got a big magnetic field, and this is linked to the sun's magnetic field, or indirectly linked via the poles. The sun's magnetic field does connect to the Earth, sometimes directly, but mostly it's upsetting the Earth's magnetic shield and causing that to vibrate and giving us geomagnetic activity. And in fact, on the 8th of this month, there was a huge amount of geomagnetic activity, which coincided with the earthquake. You see, the big solar flare was on the 6th, and there was a huge amount of geomagnetic activity. Well, on the 7th as well, but on the 8th in particular. So you get a few days, not many days after these big events on the sun, there will be events on Earth.
Piers Corbyn is our guest. It's exactly 25 minutes to the top of the hour. We've got Piers pretty much right up until the end of the programme, which is this hour. He'll be with us for another 20 minutes. Go to weatheraction.com. Subscribe to Piers if you can. I think he's great. I think his work is terrific. It's vital. It's a crying shame that when we talk about these issues, or when they are discussed on television, that he isn't often, he does get asked on occasionally, but isn't often invited to share his thoughts and his opinions.
For ages, yeah.
Not been on the BBC for, one of the times we talked was after that disgraceful performance by Nicky Campbell on the Big Questions. We won't get into that now, but
oh my God,
horrendous excuse for journalism, absolutely dreadful. It's great to have Piers on the programme. I'm going to put your questions to Piers about weather manipulation in a minute. Before we do that, keep your tweets coming in. It's at Richie Allen Show on Twitter. It really is good to be talking about this. This is huge. What about then, people say there's no such thing as coincidences, Piers. Al Gore's sequel is out. Everybody's talking about it, right? And we have this event, and it's been blamed on man-made CO2. You made the point a few minutes ago. There's been no increase in man-made CO2 in the last 12 months. It's kind of ridiculous to link it to CO2.
Yeah. Or this last week, it's going to happen in the last week. Well, I think the good thing is to look at the actual statistics. We've been talking a lot about Florida. Now, in recorded history, there's been 12 hurricanes. This is in the last 98 years. 12 Category 4 or 5 hurricanes which hit Florida, right? That was in 98 years. Halfway back is 1968. Before 1968, 9 of those 4 or 5 category hurricanes came, and after 68, there were 3. So there's been 3 times as many in an earlier stage as to in the last since 1968. So their argument is increasing CO2 would have increased these hurricanes, but in fact there's been less. So if you want to use the statistics, it would mean that more CO2 equals less severe hurricanes hitting Florida. I mean, that is the data. And what are they arguing? What are they claiming? I mean, it's absurd. They've got no evidence whatsoever for any of their claims. They're completely made up. They have a theory, and they believe in the theory, but the theory doesn't work.
Now, back in 1977, 48 countries ratified the Convention on the Prohibition of Military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques. That's a mouthful.
Yeah.
That's a mouthful, of course, but what it means is back then 48 countries agreed not to try and weaponize the weather. Now, since then, 77 countries in total have signed up to it. There are people, Piers, and they're not all wacky conspiracy theorists. I've spoken to academic men and women. They say the reason this treaty was ratified in 1977 is because even back then, the Pentagon and the other military wings of Western powers, the military wings of the governments, had the technology to accelerate weather systems, to manipulate weather systems. Is it something you come across? Do you believe that the technology is there for people to bring about storms?
Yeah. There is technology there that's been there a long time. The simplest thing is you have to encourage a cloud which exists to drop rain. That means it's called cloud nucleation. And you could drop little crystals of silver iodide into the cloud, and that would help the nucleation of water droplets, and that causes rain. Or a cheaper method is solid carbon dioxide. Put that in, and that will cause the rain to occur. You can only do this when there is a cloud around to do it with, but that is definitely been done, has been done, and it is used or can be used to make rain come, and that could be used for military purposes. And now, there's other ideas of military purposes, namely HARP and so on, which is projecting energy into the ionosphere in the hope that it'll do something. Now, that is experimental, and I've no doubt it is of military. Well, it is a military thing. I suppose that violates this treaty. I don't know, but they would probably just tell you it was research.
And one of the things I like about you is you and I spoke about geoengineering before. And I remember when we first spoke, I thought, well, this will be interesting. I wonder what Piers will say. And we spoke about geoengineering, and I was very interested in your belief that, again, it has gone on and maybe is going on.
Oh, it is going on, is it? Yeah. The trouble is when you see a chemtrail or something in the sky, you don't know if it's a chemtrail or just a normal trail from an aeroplane. And that is the problem, of course, because people who don't want to believe it will just say, oh, well, that's normal. Now, so you're not going to solve that by looking at the sky. There has to be, proper inquiries. And, governments have to, and people in parliaments, European Parliament, British Parliament, any parliament, have to ask what is going on.
It's amazing, Piers.
Of information, but it's not secret. You see, there's conferences on this stuff. Now, the military aspects, maybe they don't talk about them much, but there's definitely conferences which talk about geoengineering because they believe this is a way of cooling the planet by putting stuff up there and so forth. Now, I don't believe they have the technology to do anything effective as yet, but there's no doubt that that's what they want to do.
That they're doing it. You know what's interesting to me, Pierre? Because I'm very much, I shouldn't say I'm like you. You're a very bright man. You're an academic man. But like you, I try to only talk about what you can prove and what you can't prove. Like you, I believe it's gone on. But we get some horrible stories through the mainstream media which make you want to investigate them. For one, for one, that bees are suffering levels of dementia never seen before. We know that heavy metals like aluminium and other metals are definitely a cause of dementia. You know, I know some wonderful people in Maui. A wonderful man called Bruce Douglas in Maui, a wonderful man, a decent man, who's been tracking massive levels of these heavy metals in the soil in Hawaii that have never been there before. There's no doubt it's going on, but as you said, there have been conferences. I think even politicians in New Zealand or Australia, MPs, members of Parliament, have tried to get this discussed, to try to get this on the agenda, to find out if it's being done, who's doing it, who's overseeing it. From what I'm getting from you, you still retain the belief that there's a strong possibility that experimentation is going on.
Oh yeah. I'm sure it's going on. Yeah.
And yet you get called.
There are conferences that happen. I don't know if you can sign up to them. I mean, you probably have to be vetted and all that stuff. But it does need politicians to I mean, well, the Green Party, for example, what do they do? Because they're always talking about this, that, or the other, but I don't see them campaigning about chemtrails. No, why don't they? I don't know. I mean, that's maybe they're part of an agenda of globalization, which the only thing they think is important is carbon dioxide, which is the thing of least importance, actually.
And as a weatherman, Piers, and you have access, of course, to technology, you have access to radar, you regularly see these trails that just don't dissipate the way that water vapor should do. You see these trails that not only hang around for ages, but they tend to kind of fatten out, don't they, and leave a kind of a milky white kind of haze in the sky.
Yeah. That's true. I mean, of course, there may be some cloud formations that do that as well, so you have to be careful what you're looking at. But I mean, there is stuff put up there, and it does do this. Now, what is the actual scale of it? Difficult to know. And what effect is it having? Well, I mean, where this stuff falls on land, there will be poisoning of the land. But I think that it's not a vast scale as yet. I mean, it may be a lot more than I imagine. I don't know. I mean, the thing is, there's just not reliable information to tell us what is going on, and the only way to get that is by, inquiries in parliaments where MPs demand, because in the end, the state apparatus in America or Britain will reveal what is going on under duress,
When certain people come out, and you and I have got mutual friends, I won't mention our mutual friends because they might not want mentions, but some of our mutual friends, they go as far as to say that some of this stuff has got very sinister connotations, things like making people ill and keeping people ill and keeping people stupid and ultimately getting rid of people. Is that a step too far for you, Piers?
Well, I don't know. No, I've heard all that. I mean, I'm not saying I believe it or not, but I mean, certainly. One is it harmful? Yes. Then you're saying, well, okay, it's deliberately put there to kill people. Well, I don't know about that. I mean, it's put there to supposedly control weather and save the planet, whereas it's in fact it's making people ill. Yes, but there's a lot of medical stuff around which doesn't necessarily do you, like chemotherapy is an extremely dangerous process, for example, which, it may kill cancer, but it also kills people. So, there's a lot of arguments for and against various measures which mankind can do. Now, I don't accept that there's any validity whatsoever in trying to control weather by these chemicals. The people who are doing it, though, may think that's what they're doing, and there is a side effect of people getting ill.
So the question begs to be asked: why would you do it? But we're talking about a deep state, aren't we? Now, I'm no fan of Donald Trump. I don't want to get all Trump-esque here, but there is a deep hidden state, and there is the military-industrial complex, and there are people operating outside the jurisdiction of public scrutiny, of oversight. There's no political oversight, and who the hell knows what they're doing. And that's why we go back again to the, to the weaponization of the weather. Some of our listeners, Piers, I was away for a few weeks. Richie, this is guaranteed to be weaponization. This is what's happening in Florida. And I say to those people, look, you don't know that. You don't know that, We're not saying that people can't do that, but we don't know that.
Okay, so is somebody somewhere pressing a button like in HAARP, this microwave radiation into the ionosphere to try and make Hurricane Irma do something? Well, I don't know, but you see, we had a solar flare, and there's no way that HAARP can trigger solar flare.
No.
Right? So, I mean, there are real natural things going on. Wherever these people in HAARP think, oh, there's something real going on, let's make it worse or something. I don't know. That's possible, but I would suggest that you ain't going to do anything more than an X 9.3 flare can do, because on the sun, the size of that solar flare was 200 times the Earth's area, i.e., you could swallow up 200 Earths into that thing.
Wow.
On the sun. So, this is a very, 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 very powerful event. Now, the sun's a long way off, of course, but, it makes serious things, and it made this big geomagnetic storm. Namely, the whole of the Earth's magnetic field was vibrating like crazy. You in
the few times we've spoken on air, you deal in facts, but you're very, very humble.
Yes.
You're humble, and you're decent enough to say, well, anything is possible. And then you talk about what you know about chemtrails, which is marvellous. Mm-hmm. You do set yourself up, though, to be beaten with that stick, don't you, by the establishment? Because of your honesty. I mean, you don't make any claims. You don't say, this is definitely happening, or that's definitely happening. No, you're decent and you're academic in your approach, but yet they go after you for that. I think you're very courageous to even talk about that.
I mean, I can say as a fact, there are geoengineering conferences going on, which you can find out about. Now, what happens after that and what geoengineering is done, well, that is maybe not such a clear thing, but the science of that, if you want to call it a science, it exists. Well, it is a science, obviously. Yes, it's involving measuring and changing things, either for good or bad.
And I certainly didn't want to be bringing up Jeremy. I don't want to be bringing up Jeremy, but I mean, I know that, I suppose the not established, Jesus Christ, you are established. You're an academic man. You've earned your rights to be where you are. But the mainstream, meteorologists, are these the people that the Environment Secretary would be speaking to? I mean, is anybody asking the Secretary of State for the Environment, listen, what's going on above our skies? I mean, is anybody asking that question? Probably not.
Well, I don't know. That is a good question, and I know a number of MPs that are interested, but they could ask that. I mean, but what I think it needs is a concerted sort of cross-party thing, because there's a number of MPs in different parties who are scientists and do have concerns. And I think at some point they have to get together and ask questions about geoengineering. Not make it a kind of one-party sort of
course,
crazy-sounding thing. I mean, there's reasonable politicians who have got nothing to lose, by actually finding out what is going on. And if any of their constituents have been affected or apparently affected, then they've got a good reason to investigate.
By the way, just for listeners' benefit, it's Michael Gove is the Secretary of State for the Environment, and it would be the opposition who would be asking him questions about that. Piers Corbyn is on the line. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left with Piers. Great that Piers is on. Terrific that he's on. Really important stuff. This. Are we, I suppose, condemned to be always talking about this in the shadows then, Piers? Because, you know and I know that something is going on. But to try and get this onto a kind of a mainstream platform, to get somebody in, in the Daily Mail, heaven forbid, the Guardian, the BBC to talk about this. I mean, how do you go about that?
Well, I think the mood is changing. I mean, we attended, me and Mark Windows, your former colleague of Windows on the World, we attended some green gatherings, some green green events, festivals. And we gave some talks at these. And I put the view that, look, we've got to have true green policies. We've got to defend biodiversity and stop bees being injured, everything like that. But carbon dioxide is not a problem. And that is just a fake green. So we have to distinguish between fake green and true green. And we shouldn't go along with the CO2 story because it's used to deindustrialize the West and put up energy prices and so forth. And actually what we said went down very well. I mean, so, the greenest of the green people are realizing they have to, get their heads together and not be used by the globalists.
This is brilliant. And finally on this, because we're just about out of time, and thanks for coming on tonight, Piers. Finally on that, Mark Windows was on the programme recently. I spoke with Mark today, by the way. He'll be on again with me either next week or the week after. WindowsOnTheWorld.com. Check Mark out, by the way. He interviews some terrific people, and there's a lot going on there. Good shout, Piers. By the way, I mean, this climate change denier bollocks. Excuse me for swearing. Well, I kept my nose clean all show. I didn't swear all show. This bollocks about climate change denying. Are we worried? You see, this particular parliament, the government have indicated that they're going to go after extremists of all kinds on the internet. Do you worry that they're going to try and criminalise almost those who ask questions? Because what they want to do is say...
Well, they do want to criminalise lots of people, yeah. Well, Theresa May had a meeting with Macron about controlling the internet. Well, supposedly to do something or other useful. I can't even remember what it was, but, I don't think any control of the internet that she would produce would be to benefit the democratic process somehow.
I'm going to give you an absolute final. This is the absolute final question.
Okay.
Andy tweets, would Piers have any opinion on whether other weather organisations, so other meteorological services, do you think the staff are gagged in terms of they are not allowed to mention the term geoengineering? But you can only speculate about that, I suppose, Piers.
Well, I would think they stuff like that. I think anyone who worked for a meteorological state organisation wouldn't be allowed to speak about it unless they got clearance. I would have thought. See, bear in mind the Met Office is essentially a part of the Ministry of Defence, and all of these Met Offices around the world are similar things because their origin was actually to get the weather right for military aircraft during wartime. So these people are controlled, and they may well have opinions of their own which they will not readily pronounce.
Listen, come back anytime. Thanks for the work you do. I'm going to give another plug to weatheraction.com. Support Piers' work. It needs support. He's on a donation drive at the moment. Get on to weatheraction.com. There isn't a meteorologist. Subscription drive. There isn't another meteorologist on planet Earth who has the courage to talk about these things. Thanks, Piers. Continued success to you, mate.
Thank you.
And talk again real soon. Piers Corbyn live on the line to us there from his office in London. Weatheraction.com. Do subscribe to the service there. I can't recommend it highly enough.